Okay.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sergio Amaral. I am in the board of CEBRI, and I was ambassador to a few countries, and I was very much involved with this program since the beginning, because it was our initiative of the group of Brazil-United States to apply for the consulate and to be accepted as the members of the group which started this program. This program is basically part of a wider program sponsored by the United States, which is America in the world. And our section is Brazil and the US, and today we will also talk about China. In the context of this program, we had 5 seminars. One is on multilateralism, the other one is on environment, the third one is Brazil-European Union, the fourth one is Brazil, United States, China. This is the one we have today. And finally, we'll have in January a seminar on trade. I'll say a few words as a summary to the webinar we organized, the group of United States. And it is basically, or part of it, it is about the transition which took place in Brazilian foreign policy, or the relationship between the United States and Brazil, from a pendular relationship in which we were sometimes more closer, sometimes more distant, to another point, which we're just entering, which is a more mature relationship in which shared values may bring, and I hope they will bring about a more sustained partnership based on values that we share, basically democracy, climate. This is why all of us expect that the Lula and Biden governments will work together quite easily, much better than in the past, because they are or will be developed in the context of a cooperation and a partnership sponsored by Lula and Biden themselves. As to the this first seminar, of this first part of this seminar, we have to consider that the geopolitical tensions between the two superpowers, United States and China, which, according to Kissinger, will forge the international order of the 21st century, will go probably in the direction of cooperation or conflict, with the difference that in the case of conflict, they will bring about possibly a tragedy which we have never lived before in history. Where is this conflict between the two superpowers leading us to? I like to mention 2 comments that have impressed me a lot concerning this relationship with the two superpowers. One is by Jiang Zemin, who just died. In his meeting with Fernando Henrique Cardoso, he said in a very assertive way, China will be the superpower of the 21st century. And the second point, which also impressed me a lot, it was a comment by Daniel Coates, who was the director of intelligence for Trump. And at the Aspen Defense Summit, in a meeting of a few people, he said that the United States were not yet prepared to give an answer to the many invitations made by Xi Jinping for China and the United States to entertain a special relationship among big powers. These two comments, in my point of view, they are very important because they set the parameters for the construction of a new modus vivendi between the two superpowers. And this modus vivendi will be compounded by an alternance between conflict, as in the case, for instance, we had recently Taiwan, or cooperation, which was suffering recently in an attempt in Bali to start a new age, a new chapter of the relationship. Anyhow, we are going through an age of uncertainty, which with an alternance between moments of conflict and cooperation, and this as is one of the sources or the reasons why we live through an age of uncertainty. Of course, this brings about uncertainty for all partners of the world community, and of course, this brings about some geopolitical implications for Brazil that I'm sure will be raised later on. That as an introduction, that's all I had to say for the moment, and I pass the word to Feliciano, who will be the moderator.
Thank you, Ambassador Amaral. Thank you, everyone, for being here with us once more. My name is, for those who don't know me, my name is Feliciano Guimarães. I'm the academic director of CEBRI and also professor of international relations at the University of São Paulo. I'm here speaking to you from São Paulo. We have here in our audience Ambassador Amaral, as you saw, but also Professor Robert Ross from Boston College and Ambassador Marcos Caramuru. Professor Robert Ross is a professor of political science at Boston College and associate John King Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. He received his PhD in political science from Columbia University, has taught at Columbia and University of Washington, was a guest scholar at Brookes Institution in Washington, D.C., was a Fulbright professor at the Chinese Foreign Affairs College. In 2003, he was a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of International Strategic Studies in Tsinghua University in Beijing. In 2014, he was a visiting scholar, School of International Relations at Peking University. He has a beautiful resume. Is a great specialist in U.S. China relations. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, Professor Robert Ross, speaking from Boston to us. We also have Ambassador Marcos Caramuru, which is Brazil's former ambassador in China from 2016 to 2018. Ambassador Caramuru is a senior fellow at CEBRI, is a great colleague of ours. In my view, is one of Brazil's most important specialists on China. He has created at CEBRI a program called China, and has organized a series of webinars on the politics of China and the Chinese foreign policy. As Ambassador Amaral mentioned, this is part of a program called American in the World, sponsored by the U.S. Consulate in Rio. And it's a pleasure to have colleagues from the U.S. Consulate here with us today. So I'm going to moderate the talk. I'll give the word to Professor Robert Ross. He'll have 20 minutes to make his comments. Then I'll pass the word to Marcos Caramuru. And at the end, I'll make a couple of questions. And whoever wants to make questions, please just type on the Zoom website, and I'll collect the questions at the end. Thank you, everybody. Again, Professor Robert Ross, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Feliciano. It's an honor to be here at the Brazilian Center for International Relations, my first visit. and with two distinguished ambassadors. It's a great honor. Thank you very much. And it's a great honor to be speaking about U.S.-China relations. This is a very difficult relationship, and it continues to get more and more difficult as the years progress. We all thought that perhaps Donald Trump would be a blip in the screen and things would return to normal and to more cooperation under Joe Biden, and that didn't happen. What I want to try and do is explain what drives these two countries to such an extreme relationship that keeps getting more difficult and what the prospects are going forward. On the Chinese side, as a political scientist, I do not believe it's unfair to call China a revisionist power. Since 1949, American bases have encircled China from Korea, from Japan, from the Philippines, from Singapore. And so as a revisionist power, I believe it's only normal that China should, once it developed the resources, the Navy, the Air Force, the economy, to say that enough is enough. We want a more secure international region around China's coastal perimeter. So once that Navy began to develop, China put rather strong pressure on American alliances throughout the region. It created a crisis with Vietnam. It created a crisis with the Philippines and threatened a crisis with South Korea, not because of territorial disputes, not because of oil rigs, but because these countries were cooperating with the United States against China. They were consolidating military cooperation with these countries so as to direct that military cooperation against China. And China's signal was clear. It said, "Thou shalt not continue to contribute to American containment of China, or we will coerce you and threaten you with crisis." And in each case, China was quite successful. In South Korea, the new government, the Moon government, did a flip-flop and had very good relations and distanced itself from much of the United States policy and moved toward equidistance. In the Philippines, Duterte did the same thing. He said, "China's on the rise. We must accommodate China and move toward equidistance." And the Vietnamese have abandoned all expectation of using the United States to cooperate against China. Throughout the region, whether it's Singapore, Malaysia, or Indonesia, all these countries have said China's on the rise and they're seeing American decline. After all, power is relative. If China's rising, then there must be a declining power, and that's the United States. They have said America is less reliable than they were before because the cost of war to defend us against China will be higher. And China may not be deterred. If there is a war, we don't know who will win. But we know South Korea, the Philippines, and others will lose. So with that in mind, they've all tried to cooperate with China. Well, of course, in this world of Southeast Asia, of East Asia, of American alliances, if you are cooperating more with China, well, then you're cooperating less with the United States. And that's China's objective, to erode the American alliance system throughout East Asia, around the perimeter of China, so that China does not have to face American bases, air and naval, threatening China's coastal waters and its coastal regions. At the same time, it wants that Navy to take away America's maritime superiority, the ability to sail up and down the Chinese coastline with impunity. To a large extent, China has been quite successful. It has undermined American alliances, and it has challenged American dominance of the South China Sea. I think most observers feel that we're moving toward parity in the South China Sea. Now, none of this I find particularly aggressive. I don't find any of this belligerent. I find this the expected behavior of a rising power facing another great power that's been encircling it since its existence in 1949. Not only that, but 3 wars have been fought on China's borders in Indochina, a war in the Korean Peninsula, and of course, from the Chinese perspective, the United States continues to help Taiwan separate itself from the mainland. So this is, to me, all expected behavior. And indeed, in many respects, China's threats against these countries have relied on the Coast Guard, relied on fishing ships, unarmed fishing ships, rather than their Navy. So the mere presence of a rising power has been enough to achieve China's objectives to weaken American alliances. Now, in this context, China's foreign policy diplomacy is quite clear. It wants a good, peaceful international environment, not because it's a peace-loving country, but because it's risen up through the years by having cooperation with other countries. So it wants to expand trade and investment cooperation with Europe, it wants to improve relations with South Korea, with Japan, with any countries in the developing world. And the way you do that is you put on that smiling face and you want to have cooperation. You don't want hegemony. You don't want great power conflict. You want trade and cooperation to the benefit of all. And so that's how the Belt and Road Initiative fits into Chinese policy. That's how the Asian Infrastructure Bank fits into Chinese policy, and multilateral diplomacy to create that international environment in which conflict and tension is low so that China can rise peacefully with minimal conflict that might derail China's rise. Now, of course, from the US perspective, this is not a very satisfactory trend. The US is a declining power. In many respects, it's watching its security in East Asia decline overnight. The cornerstone of American security in East Asia since World War II was that alliance system. And now when we see South Korea, Philippines, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia moving toward equidistance, the United States is losing its alliance system. Not only that, but the United States has a minimal ability to respond. Perhaps the United States would raise a naval arms race with China to try and maintain superiority, but it can't. The US federal budget just doesn't have enough money to build a large enough Navy to compete with China. While China's Navy should reach 400 ships in a few years, American Navy is declining by 15 to 20 ships per year. So the trend is continuing against America as the gap between America and China narrows, and soon China will simply be a greater naval power in East Asia. The American Navy knows this. So when we think about the Quad or the Indo-Pacific strategy, the American Navy is pulling back to India, looking for secure facilities, naval facilities. The US, Australia, and United Kingdom agreement was designed to consolidate strategic cooperation with Australia because we're losing the Philippines and South Korea. We've consistently improved defense cooperation with Japan because it's so much more important today when it's the sole ally the United States can count on inside East Asian waters. But not only that, the United States is active in the Western Pacific, Tinian, Wake Island, Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, spreading its new basing system all around East Asia as an alternative to being inside East Asia. So while China's maximizing its power inside East Asia, trying to keep America out, America is going to wage a new containment strategy with its Navy and Air Force to keep China inside, and so the United States can dominate the Indian Ocean and the Western Pacific. Now that's the longer term trend, but simultaneously, the United States is not happy with decline. And at the level of civilians and diplomacy in the White House, the executive branch, it's quite clear the United States wants to maintain hegemony, maintain its superiority across the board, refusing to acknowledge China as a peer competitor. And we can see that line in American thinking in the trade war. Most Americans who follow these things will say America's losing the trade war, but they will not concede because they believe the long-term trend in the trade war is to America's advantage, despite the impact on American inflation. You can see the impact on the White House's statement on the American strategy. We must dominate the rules-based international order. Not clear why. It's not so clear China's revolutionary, but American dominance is what's important. In a recent speech by the American Secretary of Commerce, it's made clear that we see the Chinese economic system, their domestic economy, as a target of our trade policy and our business policy. So as to compel that economic system that has helped China so much to begin to degrade. So this is a full-fledged containment policy from the United States in which we're waging indeed a Cold War technology policy. Unlike Europe, unlike Japan, unlike South Korea, we're not selecting particular technologies that have a security risk, but we've aimed at the entire Chinese technology industry. Trade, we've aimed at the entire Chinese economy, and we've aimed at undermining Chinese influence in the world order. This is America's role. We're playing our historically assigned role as the declining power, resisting the decline, retrenching from East Asia, but throughout the world, trying to maximize our coalitions against China and strengthen America's economic and technological superiority to try and maintain dominance despite the trend in the US and Chinese navies. Now, having said that, it should be clear that their leaders still make choices. So what we're seeing in the United States is a trend that started in the Trump administration, and this administration has doubled down on trade, doubled down on technology, increased the opposition to China's role in the world order. Those are choices, and those choices bring costs. So we all worry about a war over Taiwan. We worry about a war in the South China Sea. We worry about what a trade war might do to the US economy. We worry about the cost of a technology war to the American technology industry. And so the questions we all need to ask is whether or not on the Chinese part, their relentless expansion is detrimental to the world. And on the American part, whether our response is detrimental to its allies, the United States. And with that in mind, we need to just remember that there are choices. Does the trade war need to be exercised the way it is? Does China need to create crises in the South China Sea to challenge American alliances the way it does? Going forward, there is no evidence whatsoever that China is going to relent on its naval buildup. On the contrary, its naval buildup is continuing. Its tech industries is going to double down on having autonomous tech industries. And there's no indication the United States is going to ease its Taiwan policy, is going to ease its technology policy, or is going to make compromises on the ideological or trade wars. But the trend is one of increasing tension. We all need to be concerned as we watch this trend, because war over Taiwan is always a possibility. Unintended war in the South China Sea is always a risk. And should these two great powers not be able to manage their economic, technological relationship, it's clearly possible that the rest of the world, Europe, United States, Latin America, could be dragged into a polarized conflict worldwide that would be detrimental to everyone. So as we watch the United States, as we watch China, think about how they might wage this power transition conflict between a rising power and a declining power of the United States, how they might wage this conflict in ways that might be less costly to themselves and less costly to the world. Thank you, please.
Thank you, Professor Ross, for your remarks. And now, Ambassador Karamuru, you have the floor. Thank you for being here with us.
Good evening, everyone. I think my role here is to address the topic from the point of view of a Brazilian, and in particular, a Brazilian who was ambassador in China and can see the China eyes on this topic. Let me start by saying that the main comment that I have in reaction to the title of our debate, China, US in a New Era, is quite simple. Engagement is not possible. Decoupling is not realistic at this point. The economies are too much intertwined. Coexistence is the only choice available. And what one can expect is that under the umbrella of coexistence, a minimum dialogue will be possible on key international issues. In this regard, Biden-Xi meeting in Indonesia, the recent meeting, is a breath of fresh air after a long period of no dialogue. I'll make 3 comments about the topics before us. The first comment is about China's objective in the context of China-US relations. The second comment is about China and the international order. And the third comment is about China and Brazil. I think what China expects in the context of China-US relation is the recognition of its role as a leader in its own region and a leader worldwide. China repeats several times that the US is following a Cold War mentality, that the US is approaching US-China relations from the point of view of the zero-sum game. And of course, as part of the recognition, China expects the recognition of its hegemonic position in the Pacific. A renowned Chinese scholar, Professor Yan Shuitong, has said that China's hegemony, if it's not accepted, China will not be able to reach the objective of China's rejuvenation. This, as Professor Ross mentioned, is a non-start for the United States, and it's also a non-start for a number of countries in East Asia. At this point, China has another objective in East Asia, which is very significant in my view, not to lose its connection with the production chain with neighboring countries. And we have seen China making moves in that direction. And I have seen recently moves, very interesting moves, such as the idea of incorporating Thailand into the corridor of Guangdong, Hong Kong, Macau, which is a development corridor of the South, or the idea of the China, Laos, Thailand connectivity development corridor. And we, Brazilians, will be paying attention to the next moves China will be made in that direction. China does have a chance to succeed in keeping the production chain associated with it, but this will depend, one, on the Chinese capacity to recover stable growth and minimum growth, and two, the Chinese capacity to undertake structural reforms that are desperately needed to make the Chinese model sustainable. My second comment is about China and the international order. China is a strong supporter of the international order as it stands, multilateralism and the order as it's well known. But at the same time, China talks about an order that responds better to the new world reality and to the objectives and the expectations of developing countries and emerging markets. So it's a dual speech. And China has a number of concepts introduced in this reality of reformulation of the international order that have a lot to do with Chinese philosophy, but are not clear to other players in the international order. One is the concept of a community with a shared destiny. The other is the concept of win-win solutions. And within this context, China started to talk of a number of initiatives. One is the so-called Global Development Initiative. The other is the Global Energy Partnership, International Cooperation on Global Food Security, Global Security Initiatives. These concepts are yet to be well defined. And at this point in time, it's impossible to understand fully how China intends to be a leader in the new international order. So far, China has followed a pragmatic approach based on trade and investments, in particular investments in infrastructure. So far, this has been a successful proposition, but it's not enough to understand how China thinks about restructuring of the new international order. My third comment, I think I still have a few minutes, is about China and Brazil. Brazil and China have very much a business-oriented relationship focused on trade and investments. And so far, this relationship has been highly successful. The political dialogue is limited, but the fact that Brazil has independent positions on international topics opens a space for dialogue and generates mutual respect in the relationship. But the relationship will have to evolve. We cannot restrict the relationship forever to growing trade and a few Chinese investments in Brazil. And there are a number of new topics in the international agenda that will have to be incorporated in the China-Brazil relationship. One is climate change, the other is the energy transition, the other is technology and its impact on labor productivity, the other is ESG principles in the private sector. There are a number of topics that will have to be able to entertain a dialogue with China. Brazil and China have enough conditions to incorporate these topics into our bilateral agenda. But this will require creativity and commitment and a certain engagement, and above all, an idea that we have to go further and we cannot be restricted to a very pragmatic idea of bilateral relations. At this point in time, it seems that China is looking for friends to strengthen friendship in the international reality, and even to discuss political topics. And we are connected to China within the context of BRICS. I think that the fact, as I said before, that we have a very independent dialogue, position on political topics in general, will also open the doors for a more productive and more intense dialogue with China in BRICS. And again, the credibility of our foreign policy is going to work in a good direction. But again, a sense of creativity, a knowledge of what we need and what we want in international relations, and a better knowledge of where China is heading to are going to be essential points to make things work in a reasonable way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Karamuru. I have now a few questions that I made myself here based on this conversation and also the previous interest in the issue of U.S.-China relation and its effects in Latin America. So I'm going to pose two questions to all of you, to Ambassador Amaral, to Professor Robert Ross, and to Ambassador Karamuru. And then we go to the questions from the audience. We're receiving questions from the audience, so please feel free to send any questions to the Zoom system here, please. So my first question is the effects of the U.S.-China rivalry or rise and fall in Latin America. So the story of declining U.S. influence in the region is hastily acknowledged by many people. The concurrent story of China's rise in the region is also easily taken for granted. But when it comes to historical ties and accumulated investments, whether they're economic or political in Latin America, in Brazil especially, the U.S. has the tools to exert a much more encompassing and broad influence in the region than China. There is no doubt that China's rise has increased the Chinese profile in Latin America and in Brazil in particular, but its political and cultural influence is still lagging behind compared to the United States. Moreover, the growing Chinese influence seems to be more economic than strategic or political. So in this sense, there is no doubt that the U.S. plans to contain China in Latin America, but its tools, on the other hand, are more political and strategic than economic and commercial. While China's, as I said, instruments are more economic. So it seems that there is a balance between these two powers in Latin America. On one hand, you have the West with more cultural and political ties and more political capacity to have influence in the region. On the other hand, you have China with more economic influence and trade-related influence, as Ambassador Karamuru mentioned. So my question is, can countries in the region, especially Brazil, play China against US and vice versa? In other words, can they use the two types of influence in their favor? And if they can, and especially Brazil, how do you see that? What are the best options for Brazil on that direction? And my second question has to do how Brazilians in particular perceive Chinese and Americans. So I've been working with public opinion for quite some time in Brazil, and we're asking Brazilians about a series of foreign policy issues and international relations issues. In these public opinion surveys, they show that Brazilians have always been in love with Americans and American culture. There are no other country in Latin America that love Americans like Brazilians do, right? We're by far the country in the region that has the more positive view of US and American culture. But the same cannot be said about China. Although Brazilians do not dislike China, have a negative view of China and the Chinese culture, but they perceive it either too far away from Brazil or they know too little about it. For example, in the same surveys, we questions Brazilians which society Brazil should follow as a role model for Brazil's future, whether Germany, US, or China, or South Korea. I don't even know why South Korea is there on the questions, but the majority of the people respond that they prefer Germany and US as Brazil's role model. So my question is, how can China capacity in the obvious very high capacity in terms of economic influence and trade influence in Brazil change such perception about China or Chinese culture in Brazil? Can they use their economic tools to change the perception in the region? And how do you perceive that? So these are my general first two questions. I think Ambassador Amaral, do you prefer to go first?
I can. Yes, I like the two questions because they address very timely situations. First, Karamuru mentioned that China is looking for friends. What would that mean at the moment when the United States is also looking for friends in Latin America after they realized that they are lagging behind vis-a-vis the growing presence of China in Latin America? So are we going to watch the two countries, the United States and China, to go in the same direction on our territory or in our space? I don't see that very much. I think that I can understand that China is looking for friends everywhere in the world, and certainly they will try to do that in Brazil, where they have been doing that. But until now, I didn't realize quite clearly what kind of presence the United States are looking for. Certainly, they want to be more present. The recent developments with respect to the visit by Sullivan, the Secretary for Defense for National Security, has shown, but I don't realize, neither from China nor from the United States, very concrete steps being done in order to gain more room in Brazil or in South America. Now, with respect to perceptions, or what Feliciano has mentioned about the presence of the perception of the presence of China in the United States in the region, I think he's right, because China doesn't know yet how to do that. The presence in Brazil would justify a much higher visibility in our country, which I think doesn't exist. And I think the United States is not yet concerned with this issue at this early stage of the US comeback to Latin America.
Thank you, Ambassador Amaral. Professor Robert Ross, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I think you make an important point, Feliciano, on the different strengths these two countries have in Brazil. Certainly, China is a market for Brazil much larger than the market of the United States, nearly twice the size. And that makes for export dependency greater on China than on the United States for GDP growth. And that presumably gives China some leverage. But overall, Brazil is a large economy with a diversified exports. And so the Chinese leverage over Brazil is somewhat nominal. At the same time, Brazil is the fifth largest exporter to China in the world, so that there is a mutual relationship there, not one of dependence. And I think that's a very strong asset for Brazil. Second, you ask about leverage and whether China can exercise its leverage. And I question that, I think, on two fronts. There are a lot of countries that participate in the Brazilian economy, so that Brazil cannot be twisted or leveraged by China. On the other hand, the question you ask is, can Brazil leverage the United States and China by playing them off each other? Because each has assets to play. And I certainly think that you do have different strengths, but the reality is the United States has no money. So here we have the United States competing around the world with China on foreign aid, foreign investment, and we're failing. Whether it's in the Western Pacific, whether it's in Central Asia, China's Belt and Road Initiative, China's direct foreign aid is 10 times larger than anything the US and Europe can do. So that same thing exists as a reality for Brazil in dealing with the United States. If the US had equal resources to bring to bear, we might compete with China for economic influence, but we don't. So that trend of greater Brazilian cooperation with China as regard to the United States is simply going to grow. And this is part of a reality because China's market is 5 times larger than the American market. And it's growing faster than the American market. So other things being equal, Brazil is going to continue to export far more to China than it's going to export to the United States. And there's very little the United States can do about that, and very little the United States can do about the competition of aid or investment for infrastructure. Now, on the other hand, I don't think this is a problem for the United States because we should welcome the development of the South American, Latin American economies. I think this is good for everyone. I think infrastructure development around the world is good for everyone. The United States should have sufficient confidence, and you say, in our cultural relations, our political relations, and simultaneously, we shouldn't see the Chinese Navy becoming a global Navy, and next thing you know, it's going to dominate the Panama Canal or dominate the east or west coast of the Western Hemisphere. So we should have enough confidence to be able to say that China's investments throughout the world, including in Brazil, is a net plus for everyone, while having the confidence to say it doesn't present a challenge to American interests, security interests, political interests in Latin America.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Ambassador Karamuru, you have the floor.
Well, I think that the major difference between the US and China having relations with Latin America is that in China, business and government issues are connected. In the US, business is business, government is government, and these issues are disconnected. And what we see many times is China trying to convince everyone that its companies are private, or some of them are private, and don't have any state influence and any government influence, which doesn't make that much sense because we know that there's a strong dialogue between private sector companies and the government in China, or the United States saying that they are now going to help to finance infrastructure, or they are going to create funds to do that, which doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense for me too. So I think the basic thing that we have to understand is that the framework for relations with China and for relations with the United States is different, you see. And we have intense relations with the financial sector in the United States, with investors, with FDI in Brazil and in Latin America. And you have a number of government discussions with the United States. To a large extent, the dialogue, the overall connection with the United States is richer. And I'm not talking about the cultural points that you mentioned, and that are very essential points. But we have to face reality as is, and not to build a reality which is not really a reality just because the other country is doing something that we will be able to compensate its own influence. In the area of perceptions, I'm not that much convinced that China wants to change its perception of Latin America. Of course, China would like everyone in the world to accept that, well, China is has some connection with democracy because they listen to people. They just listen to people a lot about COVID, when you see COVID reactions and the reaction of government. Yes, they do. But this is not going to change our perception of China. So in the last analysis, I think China wants to be perceived as a country that has a contribution for the economy of Latin American countries. And that's enough for them. I don't see China that much interested in going further than that. At some point in time, maybe China will need to do, or China will learn to do. And then we are going to see perhaps a new Chinese exposure in the region. But so far, I think Latin Americans are happy to see investments and trade. And China is very happy to have this business-oriented relation, very pragmatic, as they like to say.
Thank you, Ambassador Karamuru. Just a footnote. We have a Professor Robert. We have a journal at CEBRI. It's called CEBRI Journal. It's like it mimics like foreign affairs. It's a policy-oriented journal, and we interview a former Brazilian Minister of Defense. And I was asking about the military relationship between Brazilian military and the American military and the Chinese, and all weapon sale to Brazil and all that. And I said, so what? And I asked him, what about Chinese? Are the Chinese? So when you look at the makeup of the Brazilian military, whether it's the Navy or the Army or the Air Force, it's predominantly European American weapons or Brazilian-made weapons, right? So there were almost no Russian or Chinese. And then he thought about it and he said, well, I spent 2 years in the Ministry of Defense. I have never received a single trade mission from the military, the Chinese military, to sell weapons in Brazil. I think that's more or less related to what Ambassador.
I would say that's a good thing, Feliciano, because if that were to happen and you were become an active purchaser of Chinese weaponry, then America might get concerned.
Exactly. That was my point. So I think it has to do with Ambassador Karamuru mentioned. Maybe the Chinese don't want to make one step further. You know, they know that's a little bit dangerous, that Americans might react negatively. If you look at the literature and the relationship between U.S. and Latin America or South America, you'll see that every time there was a foreign power in Latin America, Soviet Union or Germany, that's when the United States reacted negatively and violently against specific Latin American countries. So if the Chinese might have learned from that, maybe from history, and they know that it's a little bit dangerous on that, if they do that next step. Ambassador Marcos, please.
Yeah, let me make a very short comment. I participate in a number of debates with China and Chinese institutions about Latin America. And China does not want to be perceived as a big leader in Latin America because it does not want the US to be perceived as a big leader in Asia. The fact is that US is a big leader in Asia, but they are always very much worried about that the idea is that they want to keep good relations with the region, but not too much, not to create the impression that they want to occupy a space that is not theirs.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
So
we have Ambassador Amaral, please go ahead.
Yes, just to follow up on this point, which I agree, Chinese are very cautious when they come to a country not being perceived as a threat. And this is very clear. Take the example of trade. Uruguay decided they want to have an agreement with China, a trade agreement. Will China respond positively to that? I doubt. China is not going to intervene with our relations with Argentina. They have, of course, recent agreements on trade, on investments with Argentina, but they are very cautious, not this step, not being perceived as a threat to our Brazilian relations with Argentina. They are extremely cautious, and they want their steps to be limited at least for some time as basically commercial and investment steps, nothing else.
Thank you, Ambassador Amaral. We're receiving a couple of questions here from the audience. Let me pick one. Let me see here. I was scrolling over them. I think it's from Alexei Davidov. So I think it's a question to Ambassador Karamuru. What areas of U.S.-Brazilian relations could have the biggest potential for development under the presence of Lula, who is starting his presidency next January? And maybe 5G technology or agriculture production. So what's your say on that? Okay, let's. I'll read more questions while Ambassador Karamuru answers this question. Thank you. You're muted, Ambassador. You're muted.
Very simple answer. I'm not going to give you time. I'm going to spend your time. Climate change. Climate change is really the topic. You're talking about U.S., Brazil, or China, Brazil? You're talking about U.S., Brazil.
Right. Sorry, U.S.-Brazil relations, and also, yeah.
I think climate change is going to dominate international discussions and bilateral understandings in the next few years. And climate change in its wide dimension, you see its impact on companies' behavior, its impact on the environment, its impact on technology. This is a broad topic with many, many aspects to be considered. This is going to be the main topic for the next few years. And I have no doubt that the Lula administration is focused on that.
Thank you, Ambassador Amaral. Now I opened here the browse correctly, so now I saw all the questions I was not able to see before. So I have a question for Professor Robert Ross. I think it might be a specific question, Professor Robert. If you don't if you don't feel comfortable to answer, don't worry about that. So it's from Erickson Scorsing. So the CHIPS Act, which is the Technology Act, can be opportunities to improve dialogue between U.S. and Brazil in the issue of technology. And how do you see that China would react to that in Latin America? And I have a question also, I think for both Professor Robert Ross and Ambassador Karamuru, from Lawrence P., which is an entrepreneur in Brazil from Chinese origin. U.S. is more of a competitor in trade, while Brazil and China have complementary economies. Right? China doesn't usually interfere in domestic affairs of other countries in Latin America, while the U.S. has a history of systematic interference, right, in the region. China economy is currently 20% larger than the U.S. in terms of purchasing power parity and growing much faster than U.S. Questions. Would it make sense for Brazil to have a closer relationship with China as opposed to the United States in this scenario?
Could you repeat the question?
It will be smart. It will make sense for Brazil to have a closer relationship with China as opposed to the relationship with the U.S. Since China is growing faster, U.S. has this history of political interference in Latin America, and China has never done so. Thank you. Professor Robert Ross, please.
Thank you. So the CHIPS Act is a symbol of America's determination to resist the rise of China by developing its own domestic technology industries in the area of artificial intelligence, quantum computers, communication technologies. And in so doing, it should be clear that we have violated the WTO in many ways because we're denying access to the American market on a level playing field to the high-tech industries of South Korea, Japan, and Europe. So rather than being a foundation for greater cooperation in high technology, it actually limits America's ability to cooperate with other countries because it said this funding and these projects must be made in America with American money. Now that's quite unfortunate because we have allies around the world, including Brazil, who could contribute and we can mutually benefit from technology development. And we do have the Europeans and the Koreans quite angry at the United States. But to the Ambassador Karamuru's point, China is looking to expand its relations around the world to have leadership. And what we're seeing with the United States is actually denying China leadership in various areas. So we mentioned climate change. And I think climate change will be a very fruitful way for Brazil to expand relations with China. China is trying to expand relations throughout the developing world, funding various climate change projects in the Western Pacific, in Africa, and elsewhere. And the United States, again, lacks the funding. And two, I don't think it has a strong interest in doing bilateral cooperation with China on climate change. It is seeking to exclude China from these areas rather than bring it in. So I think for the Brazilians, there's a real opportunity there to cooperate with China, particularly regarding the rainforest. In a larger point, we talk about Brazilian-China relations and the prospects of people-to-people relations and attitudes. It wasn't that long ago where Latin Americans did not like the United States, and I still remember the era of Yankee go home. And so China is the new kids on the block, and they're appearing in new countries, and they're throwing their money around, and they're investing, and there's going to take a while simply to get used to China as a cooperative player, a neighbor, if you will, a friend. And that's just going to take time more than anything else. And until then, I think there's simply a benefit for Brazil to cooperate. Now, whether Brazil should cooperate more with the United States or China, well, in economics, this is going to be driven by market forces. Brazil is a capitalist country, Latin America are capitalist countries. Brazil is going to pursue economic opportunities, or industries are going to pursue economic opportunities in China because that's where the opportunities are. No country in the world can exclude itself from the Chinese market and expect to succeed, and that includes the United States. And the American market is just not as attractive as it used to be, because of high technology, slower growth, a more mature economy. And so there's going to be greater cooperation with China on economics over time compared to the trend in US-Brazilian economic relations. That does not have a spillover effect for political or military affairs, though. That's a whole different world out there. And as Feliciano was saying, we haven't, or the ambassador was saying, we haven't seen Chinese interest in trying to push the envelope in challenging America in Latin America, because as been said, America would push back rather hard, and it would be in neither the Latin American countries' Brazilian interest nor in China's interest to have tension with the United States in the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you, Professor Ross. Ambassador Karamuru. Then after that, we'll go back to everyone for the final remarks. We have only 6 minutes left.
Well, first of all, I'm flattered to see Lawrence P. in the audience, and very interesting question he raised. It's not easy to have a stronger or closer relations to China, in relation to China, because we need China to understand that. And China needs to be engaged in this closer relations. And the procedures in China, for whoever knows China, understands the procedures in China are very complex, very slow, and are very difficult to understand. To entertain new discussions with China is not an easy proposition, you see. So I agree with you that the logic says that we should look for closer ties with China, not necessarily comparing with ties we have with the United States, but I agree with you, we should have closer ties, and these ties should not be restricted to trade and investment. But this is not easy. To a certain extent, it's easier to entertain the dialogue with the United States. First, because the United States is regularly an open country with an open reality. And secondly, because they understand they don't control the business and they do want to have some kind of political dialogue with Brazil and Latin America and include new topics. So it's not a simple proposition to implement what you were suggesting. The other sides must agree with it, and China in particular must agree with it. Having said that, I want to say something. Many Brazilian companies have started to understand that selling to China, it's not just a question of selling, not just a question of the market. I see more and more Brazilian companies trying to develop cooperation with universities, research initiatives in China, research for new technologies in China. They understand that they have to have allies in China and that they have to build a more comprehensive relationship in their own field instead of just selling, instead of just looking at the market. So the companies have understand that there's a balance in the relationship with China, in the dialogue with China. And this is a very positive point, and it's a strong sense of maturity from our private sector.
Thank you, Ambassador Karamuru. Now I'd like to hear the final remarks from Ambassador Amaral, from Professor Robert Ross, and back to you to wrap up, Ambassador Karamuru. Ambassador Amaral, please.
To wrap up? No.
Yes,
You would like to wrap up?
No.
I don't think that I have much to add to what has been said here. I think it will be very important for the next Brazilian government to understand the nature of the relationship with China, and to the fact that instead of trying to have good relations with one in detriment of the other, we should try to have good relations with both. And in this respect, I think it's very important to diversify our relations. The best way to have good relations with the United States and with China is having good relations with Europe, and to finalize this agreement we have, this lingering agreement we have with Europe and Mercosur. And also, I think that we have to think about South America, because either we have a foreign policy specific to South America, we will not be able to compete neither with the United States nor with China in South America. And I think it's a top priority for us to have better relations, new kind of relations with South America, and not to forget that if we want to have something in the area of the Amazon, we should include our neighbors, Andean countries, because we have a treaty with them on Amazonian cooperation, and we have to make the best of it if you want to play the role of the Amazon in our benefits.
Thank you, Ambassador Amaral. Professor Ross.
Thank you. I think it's incumbent upon all countries in the world today to try and simply navigate this US-China relationship. And every region in the world, every country in the world is finding different ways to navigate it. So for the countries of maritime Southeast Asia, we hear them say consistently, we are not going to take sides in the US-China conflict. And to a large extent, they've been successful despite intense American pressure to maintain strong alliance relations. Europe would rather not take sides, but American pressure in Europe is far greater. And the American presence in Europe is more important for European security regarding the Russians. And we see the Europeans more and more falling into line behind American policy, much to their own regret. I think Brazil is going to navigate it itself. And it's certainly an economic world. There's no reason for Brazil to take sides whatsoever. Mutual benefit from wherever you can find markets, and the Cold War as an economic competition in the United States and China need not influence anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, Mexico, Brazil, anywhere else. And of course, that's to Brazil's benefit. Right now, there's no real concern about taking sides in political or security issues. Again, as Ambassador Karamuro said, the Chinese are not pushing, and the Americans have yet to show any concern. The challenge is to keep it that way. It shouldn't be hard, but it's in the interest, I think, of all the entire hemisphere that we see economic growth, economic prosperity in the absence of military and political tension.
Thank you very much, Professor Robert Ross. Marcos, please.
I just think that with this new wave of leftist governments in Latin America, it's going to be easier to entertain a dialogue with China and look for new areas of cooperation. And Brazil, with the leftist government, is going to be part of the group because China, has a natural connection with China, with parties that follow its own ideology, and this means connections that are built by China. They invite people to go there, to talk to the Communist Party, to understand their policies and all that. But as Professor Robert Ross said, and Sergio Amaral also said, this should not change the general idea that we have to look at both sides with the same level of intensity, understanding that the topics in the dialogue with one and the other are going to be different. And we have to look for the same level of intensity, but different directions or different substance in the dialogue with these two countries.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Karamuro. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you, Professor Robert Ross, for accepting our invitation. Thank you, Ambassador Amaral, for organizing this panel. And again, thank you, Ambassador Karamuro, for being here with us. It was a great conversation. Thank you very much to the U.S. Consulate in Rio for sponsoring this panel. And I hope to see you soon in another webinar. Tomorrow's Karamuro is organizing another webinar at 9 a.m. about economic policy in China. So stay tuned. And thank you for the audience for being here with us. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.